Okay, okay, great. Well, thanks to everyone for coming, and I'm sorry that we're starting late, and it's entirely my fault. The one dispensable member of this panel couldn't make it sharp at 10, but I'm looking forward to this discussion. I was based in Kiev in the early 90s for actually Marta and we overlapped when, I guess you were doing your PhD research and doing some journalism too for The Guardian and for radio. And I haven't been back for a few years. I wish we were here at slightly more hopeful times for Ukraine, but hopefully we can also find a lot of positive things as well. And I think sort of obviously media, I mean, I have a very personal interest in free media, but it's so central to, you know, how a free society is supposed to work. So let me just get going since we are late. This is the Media, Market, and Democracy, Ukraine in the global context. And let me start with Marta, who's the one person here who I've known for a very long time. And we did meet in Kiev. I guess it was just the turn of the Kravchuk to Kuchma era, and you know, the time when Ukraine started to really become a proper nation state and really consolidate its democracy. Marta since then has got her PhD from Oxford and has moved into academia in Canada and teaches, I guess, both history and political science at the University of Western Ontario. Also taught back in Kiev at the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And let's just turn over to her.
Thank you. I'm going to stand so that you can hear me better. Is this microphone working? Beautiful, because I have a soft voice and I can never be heard without the microphone. Thank you very much all for coming on this beautiful Friday morning at Columbia University. I'd like to start by thanking Professor Mark Dyczok, who is the brains behind this whole operation. He came up with this idea to hold a conference on mass media in Ukraine, which is a topic that is still understudied in the larger context of Ukrainian studies and post-communist studies. And I'd also like to thank especially Matthew Kaminski for joining us today. He's explained that he worked as a journalist in Ukraine in the early 1990s, and after that he did such a good job he got promoted to the Paris office of the Wall Street Journal, and for the last few years he's been based here in New York. And as you see, he's extremely busy, so we're just delighted that he was able to join us here and look forward to his comments on what we're talking about. And I'm just going to grab the pointer so that I can move through this. The title of my talk, as you can see, is Ukraine's media in the context of global cultural convergence. When I mentioned this to my friend in Toronto, she said, "Oh my God, that sounds really serious." And then I got a message from a friend in Kyiv on Facebook when I posted the program, and he said, "Wow, someone's going to be talking about Ukraine in a global context," because so often people who study Ukraine study it in and of itself, or perhaps in reference to some normative standards of democracy or media freedom that don't really exist anywhere. So what I'd like to talk about is how Ukraine's media fits into larger global trends. Ukraine became independent around the time that the modern version of globalization really took off. So Ukraine has been redefining its identity in the context of larger global changes. And mass media has been at the center of this. After 20 years of Ukraine's independence, most Ukrainians identify themselves as Ukrainians. But if we look at what Ukrainians are watching on television, it is strikingly similar to what Americans and Canadians and Germans are watching on television. Sports, entertainment, sitcoms, reality shows. This is dramatically different from the situation in 1990-91 when Ukrainians had access to 3 state-owned, state-controlled channels and state-controlled content. Media is often at the center of power struggles, and often the discussions about media are about censorship and politics, which is what one of the themes of this conference is. Another way of looking at the issues is that media is at the center for the struggle over identity. that the way Ukrainians see each other, see themselves and their relationship with the world, is both shaped by and reflected in media representations. Once Ukraine became independent, it became part of McLuhan's global village. And this struggle over redefining who Ukrainians are has been happening in this larger context of globalization. When the USSR collapsed, the category of a Soviet identity disappeared. So Ukrainians had to redefine who they are and how they interact with the world. The French theorist Bourdieu has suggested that when this process occurs, there's a number of things that are happening. Institutional structures change, values change, and there's a social change that occurs that shapes this identity struggle. And the big change is in how values are being shaped. Ukraine has been undergoing all of these changes. And amidst the process of nation and state building, the state has not imposed a single vision of Ukrainianness from above. No government has actually defined this is what it means to be Ukrainian. The other thing that's been happening while all of these larger changes is the media landscape has been changing radically. And the way that media has changed is that it has become privately owned predominantly. It has diversified, it has grown, and media owners are largely driven by not democratic considerations, but like elsewhere, by profits and by corporate interests. What I'd like to suggest is by looking at media, and the public sphere with the diversification, there's a lot of different kinds of media in Ukraine. So the public sphere that Habermas used to write about has splintered into what Todd Gitlin has called public spherecules. So now there's lots of different kinds of media available, and you can find whatever you're looking for because there isn't one single public space, and the state is not imposing a special vision of, or a single vision of what Ukraine should be looking like. Media systems became globally integrated around the time that Ukraine became independent. What we see happening globally is ownership structures converge, and we have these large global media systems that are dominated by a handful of countries, led by the United States and various others. The media content is shaped and produced primarily by a handful of countries. The values that are shaped through the media are coming from these countries. Scholars have been writing about this and looking at the impact of this global convergence of media, where you have a handful of producers of media content that's being broadcast globally, and what impact this is having on global culture. And there's a divide in the literature on this. Some think this is a positive thing, that we will now have global norms and everybody will have the same value system, and this will lead to prosperity and global stability because we're all going to have the same values of democracy, market economy, and so on. Critical scholars think very differently, and they point to what they call the dangers of American cultural imperialism, that a certain set of value systems is now being globally transmitted through these global media systems. So the discussion is often what these global media systems are doing to local, national. When they say local, they mean national media systems and media cultures, or national cultures. In Ukraine, the reaction to all of this, again, the literature here is divided. Some talk about media convergence, that everybody's buying into the same way of thinking and the same value system. Others point to examples of rejection of this Americanization or Westernization. A third, and this is the one that I find most convincing, and this is Pippa Norris from Harvard has written about this, an amalgamation where Western formats are adopted and then adapted to produce a hybrid. So it's taking Western formats, but giving them, in our case, a Ukrainian flavor. What I see happening in Ukraine is it's not just this global national dimension, there's a third factor in Ukraine, and I've called that the Russia factor. Ukraine is not only subjected to these forces of globalization that are being spread everywhere, Ukraine is also being subjected to cultural forces coming from Russia. As a result of this, oops, I went ahead a little bit of myself there. What we see in media representations in Ukraine are at least 3 different visions of what it means to be Ukrainian. As I said, I don't believe there's a consensus in Ukraine what it means to be Ukrainian. Through media representations, I see at least 3 different ways Ukrainians are defining themselves. One is the cosmopolitan vision, people who are embracing the forces of globalization, the Western values. Another is what I call the residual Soviet identity. These are people who are still culturally closer to Russia and adopting that way of seeing the world. This is the continued impact of the Russia factor through media content that's coming from Russia. And a third one is what I've called a new old Ukrainian identity, and this one's the most controversial, so I'm looking forward to your feedback on this one. This is people who see themselves as Ukrainians. They're drawing on their identity from Ukrainian cultural history and patterns, sometimes with looking at issues of democracy that are universal, but a Ukrainian flavor to that. What was my next slide? All of these, the impact of all of this has very serious implications for democracy. Political scientists and media scholars have been writing about the impact of global media convergence on politics. And we often, when we look at Ukraine, we focus on the problems that are happening in that country with its democratization process. What I'd like to suggest is we look at things in a more global sense. Politics are changing globally, and media, and particularly television, is an important factor in changing the way politicians interact with society. And one of my favorite authors here is Paolo Mancini, an Italian scholar who writes mainly about Italy and what's going on in the media in Italy, but I think his analytical framework is useful globally. What he and others write about is the deterioration of traditional institutions like political parties and civic organizations. Other people like Putnam have written about this as well. And what's happening in societies is societies are being turned into audiences. And he uses the phrase audience democracy. So instead of being active citizens, they're passive viewers. And this is all happening through television. And television is selling a lifestyle. And we see politicians adopting certain values and transmitting this into society. And these values are not always democratic ones. How is this all relevant to Ukraine? A lot of these patterns, I argue, are visible in what's happening in Ukrainian society and how this is happening through media. And this is where I'm going to count on Matt as the moderator to help me with the time, because I have a lot more material to get through. So how am I doing? About halfway through?
About halfway.
Okay, beautiful.
4 minutes, that's it.
The current discussions over Ukrainians' identity are rooted in the past. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union for over 70 years, and the legacies from the Soviet era are still very relevant in the way Ukrainians are thinking about who they are and defining themselves, so the values from the past continue to be relevant in the way the discussions over identity are happening. In the Soviet period, and I'll go through this very, very quickly, the Soviet Union attempted to create a new kind of identity, the Soviet person. To a large degree, it was unsuccessful because the Soviet Union fell apart, so I call this the imperfect Soviet hegemon. It never actually succeeded in creating a Soviet identity. It was never monolithic or static. During the Glasnost years, the discussions over identity widen, and when Gorbachev loosens restrictions over media discourse, we have this national element coming up in the discourse. Censorship officially ends in 1990. It's during the Glasnost years, and also the state gives up monopoly on media ownership during the Glasnost years. So Ukraine becomes independent, and the key question is what kind of Ukraine should be built? Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, did not impose a vision of what Ukraine should be onto society. When I interviewed him in 2011, I asked him, what vision did you have for Ukraine's media? What kind of a system were you trying to set up? And he somehow didn't seem to understand the question. He said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, one of the things you were doing was reorganizing the media system. And he sort of thought about it, and he said, well, we wanted to build democracy, we wanted to build an independent Ukraine. It was sort of vague what he was imagining how this should all be. The media system during the first years of independence continued to be state-owned. So although privatization was allowed, we have the beginning of new media, private media outlets appearing, but this process is happening very slowly in the first few years. So the first period of Ukraine's independence, we're looking at a media system that is still largely state-owned and state-controlled. That said, there's a lot of innovation happening. Oh, the main television in Ukraine in the early 1990s is still the Russian Ostankino channel. Until 1994, most Ukrainians are still watching the Russian channel. That said, there's a lot of innovation that's happening on state television. I see Andriy Kulikov smiling. I don't know, Matthew, if you recognize the photo. This is a show that aired in 1994. This is Alexander Tkachenko way back then. He introduced the first analytical weekly news show on Ukrainian television. And if you look at the images, I don't know how clearly you can see them, this is the representation of the cosmopolitan Ukrainian. He's got the Eiffel Tower. He has a vision of Ukraine looking out to the world and being part of the global community. Another thing we see happening in that period is looking back at Ukraine's historical identity. There's a series of historical films called Nevidoma Ukraina that are produced at this time and also broadcast on the state broadcaster, looking at the unknown pages of Ukrainian history that have been suppressed or silenced during the Soviet era. Another thing we're seeing on Ukrainian state television in the very early years is the broadcasting of Western programming. They start by showing the Latino telenovelas because those are less expensive than the Hollywood sitcoms, so they can't afford the high-end stuff initially, but this is sort of just adapting, not adapting, this is just taking the Western model and just broadcasting. All of these are popular. New legislation is adopted in this time period. The other thing that happens in the very early phases is we see the first Western TV company in Ukraine, and this is ICTV, which our main speaker yesterday now works for, but it was set up by two Americans, and it was set up by this company called Story First Communications. They couldn't broadcast on the main channels, so they were broadcasting on these small regional channels. What were they broadcasting? They were broadcasting American sitcoms. They became the fourth most popular channel in Ukraine in the early 90s with this type of programming. So there was a lot of interest in this kind of looking out to the world and Western formats. What happens in the mid-1990s? Ukraine's media landscape is fundamentally transformed in Kuchma's first presidency. He does a number of things that will set the pattern that we still have today. The regulatory framework that he sets up, the first thing he does is he takes control over the broadcast space, because up until 1994, Russia is still broadcasting on the main channel. So most Ukrainians are still watching Russian television. In a presidential decree, he changes that, and he takes control over broadcasting on Ukrainian territory, and the Russian channels are not banned from being broadcast, they're just not broadcast on the main three channels. At this time, there's only 3 channels with national broadcast reach. So he takes, that's the first thing he does, and then he sets up a legislatory framework, all sorts of things, all sorts of laws, including protection of freedom of speech in the Constitution. What he does not do is he does not impose a single vision of Ukrainian identity. He does not say this is how Ukrainian identity should be represented. In terms of political economy, he changes the ownership structure fundamentally. And what we see here is the privatization. The serious privatization of the media, particularly the TV space, happens in Kuchma's first period. The way he does it is non-transparent, and the groups who have contacts with the presidential administration are given preferential access, and they are allowed to privatize. There are 3 main channels in Ukraine at the time. 2 of them are transferred to private hands. The way this is done, as I said, I think we all know, was very non-transparent. 1+1 and Inter are the 2 new private channels that appear at this time, and these continue to be the leaders in Ukraine's television. These are the most popular, most powerful, because they had the early start. However, they had very different visions of what Ukrainian television should be. And 1+1 is set up by 3 people, Rudnyansky, Lauder, and Rabinovich. This is an American millionaire, a Ukrainian filmmaker who's lived in the West, and a shady businessman. They create this channel, Studio 1+1, and their mission is to create an image of Ukrainians as hip, modern. It's Ukrainian speaking. They broadcast Ukrainian programs, also a lot of Western programs. They set up the best news show at the time, TSN, which continues to exist, but when they just set it up, it was the best news program in Ukraine. Inter is the other television private station that's set up at this time. Very different owners set this up. This is set up by the Kyiv clan, Pluzhnikov. He's a major player in the Kyiv early oligarchs. The State Property Fund and Russian television, ORT, has 30% of that. What kind of TV station did they set up? What vision do they have? This is the Soviet residual identity. They're broadcasting a lot of Soviet programming, old movies. The news that they broadcast on that show is Vremya. It's the Russian, the Soviet that becomes Russian news in Russian, and that continues until 2001. So they have a very different vision of what television and what Ukrainians want. Uto-Odin stays in state hands because Kuchma doesn't want to privatize everything, and that continues to be Ukrainian language. Not very interesting programming because all the innovators have moved to the private channels. So here we see those 3 very different visions of what it means to be Ukrainian. Now, 1+1 and Inter both get large audiences. They establish themselves as popular channels right from the beginning. And they continue to have a competition for ratings until the censorship intensifies in Kuchma too. So we have a diversification and very different kinds of programs, and Ukrainians are interested in different things. What happens in the second period of Kuchma's presidency? This is what I call the unusual convergence, and the dean of journalism at Kyiv-Mohyla, Yevhen Fedchenko, he's called this period as the worst of both worlds, where the value systems from the Soviet period, social justice and hard work, that's pretty much disappeared from public discourse. The negative things from the Soviet period, corruption, authoritarianism, that's very much there and growing. On the other hand, the Western cosmopolitan vision, the positive sides of Western cosmopolitanism, democracy, rule of law, is receding. What's increasing are the less good things, the individualism, the consumerism. So you've got the value systems from these 2 visions, and the worst of all of that is converging, and we see this happening in media representations. In terms of ownership structures, what happens in this period is interesting, is most of the foreign owners are squeezed out of the Ukrainian market. So control over the representational struggle becomes almost exclusively in Ukrainian hands. These 3 channels become part of one media holding, and this is a larger pattern we see. We see the concentration of media ownership that is the pattern in Western countries and globally. So Ukraine is now adopting that